right, I'm opening it up and then I'll give it a minute more and then get started. Hey everyone, welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to give it a couple minutes as people are joining, and then we will get started with our final wheel session of the series. We do have language interpretation available, so you can listen to the presentation in Spanish or English. So you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom controls a globe icon that will allow you to select a language. If you don't see the globe icon, try the more with three little dots, and hopefully you have a translation option or interpretation option that allows you to select a language. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and we'll continue perhaps to let a few more people in. And Kat and Esmeralda, if you don't mind clicking them as they pop up, that would be great. Thank you. So welcome everyone to part 6 of our R2R Recovery Wheel Forum series. This is the last section of our highlighting of the recovery wheel. So if you've joined us before, thanks for joining us again. If you haven't, welcome. These are intended to be standalone sections, but they do all circle around the recovery wheel, and so I'll orient us to that in a moment. All of the previous 5 sessions now are available on the Road to Recovery website in English and in Spanish, to serve as a resource for species working groups. So as your group is moving through the wheel, remember that those are there for context and further explanation of this tool. So I'm going to jump in and get started. So we have made it now all the way around. We started with organized network, I guess 6 months ago now at this point, and we're talking today about section 6, which is the implement action section. This section is really important, and I think from all of my conversations with species working groups, one that we are all very eager to get to, and to really be able to focus on the implementation and the action of recovery. So we're thinking about in this section how we do that, and then how we measure it, and how we remain adaptive in the process of recovering tipping point species. So today we'll move through section 6, or action category 6 in the wheel. And then I'd like to save a little time at the end to talk about the continuation of the species working group forum space and some topics that we may be interested in exploring together as we move forward. So, for those who are new to the session and the wheel, a quick orientation, and this is developed more thoroughly in the first session, so you can go back to that recording for the full walkthrough of actually how the wheel works. So there are 6 action categories, as I mentioned. Each of those action categories is broken into 3 segments, and those segments each contain 5 criteria to be evaluated by the species working group. And so in total, we end up with 90 criteria in the R2R recovery wheel, and we will wrap those up today, having moved through and discussed all 90 of those. So on the Road to Recovery website, if you download the recovery wheel tool, you see these criteria in an Excel spreadsheet format. Those come with the criteria listed, and then there's also a column that has additional comments and explanations to guide you. Some of those are what we discuss in these forum sessions, and some of those point you to other resources to explore for more information. So here is our recovery wheel. You can see the different categories around the outside, the different colors around the outside represent those action categories. We have moved all the way over here to pink. We have let me move the screen there, 5 levels moving from the inside of the wheel to the outside. So the wheel is intended generally to move around in a clockwise fashion and then from inside to out. But the R2R team acknowledges that this is not a linear process and there may be a lot of moving in different directions throughout the wheel as you move through it the first time. And then again, it's intended to be iterative and repetitive and to guide recovery as it moves forward. And so we expect teams to kind of move through maybe once to evaluate and then to track progress. There's a lot of looping that I'll talk about today. You score, a species working group will score themselves on the recovery wheel as a 0, a 1, or a 2. 2 meaning that by the assessment of the species working group, that category, that criteria has been accomplished. 1 would mean, excuse me, it's in progress. 0 meaning that that's not an area that the species working group has worked yet. And as you populate those scores in the Excel spreadsheet, you get a beautiful color-coded wheel designed by Tom Will that will shade in the areas on the wheel for your working group to give a nice visual of recovery progress. So as I mentioned, we're over here now in the implement action section of the wheel as we wrap up today and we think about what's next after completion. So I'm going to dive in the hope of saving a little time for discussion. Please jump in at any time. It's really helpful, I think, for all of us at Road to Recovery and for the other participants on the call to hear examples of the use of these different types of actions and the wheel as a whole, but also just how different species working groups have dove into these categories. So the implement action category includes 3 segments: adaptive research, ecosystem change, and sustainability. So we'll be talking about those 3 today. And how thinking about these things collectively really wraps up our journey around the wheel, but then sets us up for continuation of the work that we're doing for species. So I'm going to jump right in. This is the first segment of the implement action category, adaptive research. And so I just wanted to pop up here really quickly. The first criteria is that focus area habitat restoration research is initiated. And so I think it was section 3. I took some time to define how within the wheel we use the term focus area and that how that term is related to the limiting factors that we've identified in the previous sections and then the more specific focal areas. So focus areas being those regional, broader identified categories. So what we did as we moved through the wheel was we identified focus areas, then we really narrowed in specifically, as specifically as possible, as we talked about limiting factor identification. Now, as we think about implementation, we are thinking at that focal area scale, but we're also looking at ways to connect these initiatives with the broader focus areas, those regional perspectives. So thinking about focus area habitat restoration and research, how is habitat management related to what the species needs and related to those identified limiting factors? And really as a species working group diving into what habitat type work is going on and how it can be tied directly into the limiting factors that have been identified. So then we think about once we identify where that work is being done and that research is moving, we think about how how we can measure its effectiveness. So talk about monitoring in a minute, but we use monitoring to confirm that the habitat restoration that we're doing and investing in is actually working and having a measurable impact in mitigating whatever the limiting factor is that has been identified in this context. And hopefully, for many species, we may identify multiple limiting factors that are related to habitat restoration. And so some of these projects may have overlap, or there may be kind of subcategories within this, depending on the species specific needs. Number three, excuse me, is that research and restoration is conducted with effective community involvement. So when we think about where these focus areas are, and previously in the wheel, the species working group would have spent time thinking about who are the affected communities in that area, who are the local communities that share that space that we're identifying as critical habitat for this bird species. We believe that restoration, conservation, recovery is going to be most sustainable in the long term with community, local community involvement and investment. And so making sure that this research work, the restoration work that's going on is involving local community partners. Um, then we're thinking of number four here, scaling of restoration and management strategy is expanded. So, assuming we see initial success with these efforts, we would like to then expand outside that identified focus area into other areas that would expand the reach of this ideal habitat, protected habitat for a species. And so you'll see in the right-hand column there, it notes that numbers 1 through 4 here of the adaptive research category are designed to work as a cycle. And so as you see success in one area, that's an opportunity to expand the reach of what the team is doing and expand it. And then we need to then confirm that it's working, monitor it, engage local communities if different communities are now relevant and affected by the habitat restoration work that we're discussing. And then finally, as with any adaptive plan, we want to monitor outcomes. And so we want to think about how are we monitoring the bird population? How are we tracking it towards recovery? One of the questions that's come up in several of the other sessions is how to set those recovery thresholds. What does it mean for that particular species to be recovered? And so the monitoring is a huge piece of that, right? How are we gathering that data, but also monitoring the social pieces. And so I'll pause for questions and then we can move into talking a little bit about monitoring, but thinking about this section and this adaptive research set of criteria, does anyone have comments to add, examples from species working groups that you're involved with, questions? I'll pause after each of the categories for anything that's on your mind. You can put it in the chat or feel free to speak up if there are things you'd like to add. I'll put up this next part because perhaps this will spark some ideas, questions, examples of work that you are doing. But I tried to gather just, I get asked frequently in my work as a conservation social scientist how to implement human dimensions metrics into whether it's a grant proposal, um, a management plan, but from this monitoring perspective, how exactly do we monitor the social pieces? Um, this biological monitoring methods list is surely lacking, could be expanded a ton, and I'm sure all of you have examples from the work that you're doing there. But we'd like to pair, ideally, you can pair biological outcomes that you can monitor with social ones. One pitch I always throw in for monitoring social outcomes and human dimensions pieces of the project is that it can often take a very long time to measure a biological outcome. We often have indicators, I think, of progress, direction, but they don't always come quickly when we're thinking about ecology and biology. And the same is true for social sciences, but there are certainly social metrics that we can get very quickly. Pulses of community attitudes, support for different interventions, um, tracking policy. We know policy doesn't happen quickly, but we can do assessments of where we see environmental pieces, habitat pieces pop up in policy at different scales. Looking at outreach metrics for programs that are in place, looking at volunteer engagement and interest, citizen science participation. These are all metrics that you can get very quickly and can be good interim indicators of success of a project. Ultimately, we want to see the bird populations increase, right? That's how we will know that we have recovered them. But understanding that that process takes time, we can be strategic in implementing and using these other types of monitoring approaches in our plans. And they're very useful for grant proposals as well to be able to report metrics and progress. That's just a few of them. I love the cultural representation one too, as you're exploring an area, seeing where birds show up in the cultural pieces, in the art, in the stories. Are there festivals that use imagery related to bird species? Can be really good indicators of support you might find. Doesn't mean that if the birds aren't there, that's not someplace we could work, but it might tell us that our messaging and our approach might need to be a little bit broader, different. Comments, thoughts, other monitoring strategies that have been really successful with anybody's particular species work. Okay, I will move forward. I think, excuse me, one thing I think would be really useful as a species working group community for us to think about developing would be banks. You know, as I said, these categories are very broad. There's a lot more we can add to all of these lists. And I think it would be great to bring these together and think about how, why, and when we might use different types of monitoring strategies, and then thinking about how we can link the human dimensions type monitoring strategies with some of the biological strategies that I know many working groups are using. So that's something I think would be interesting for us to explore together. Okay, segment two within the implement action category is ecosystem change. So we've talked about adaptive research, talked about monitoring, and now we're thinking really beyond that focus area scale at ecosystems. And we're thinking broadly about partnership strategies. We're thinking about relationships between species working group and partners. So we start here with the first criteria. Partnership strategies for broad scale change are initiated. So when we really step back and we say, okay, we've got monitoring going, we've got research going, we've identified both the regional focus areas, we've looked at limiting factors that's led us to looking at specific focal areas. Now we feel like we have a good picture and we can step back and look at broader initiatives. So what are the broad scale threat reduction strategies that are relevant to this species, to the habitat restoration needs, to the limiting factors? And are we engaging with, are we heavily informed about the campaigns and the processes that go with those broader initiatives? A species working group is not responsible for, managing those, running those. I know many species working groups are certainly tied in and connected to many of those initiatives. I think the goal here is making sure that the species working group is identifying and tying into the most relevant, specific, and useful ones for their species. And then we look at monitoring the species population response to these broad threat mitigation efforts. And when we think about the species population, are we seeing any response to the type of campaign? So whether it's a private lands initiative, you see some of the examples in that first line there, grassland. I know there's a lot of very far-reaching grassland conservation initiatives. Do we see species response to those things? Number three, species requirements integrated successfully into ecosystem conservation. So when we're thinking about all we know about our specific target species, um, are the broad scale ecosystem efforts aligned well with what the species needs? And if they're not, we need to think about what kind of tweaks or changes might be needed in order for these broad scale initiatives to be actually measurably beneficial for the species and moving the population towards recovery. Um, when we look at number two in the monitoring of the population response, obviously, if we're not seeing a response or we're continuing to see population declines over time, then when we think about these broad initiatives, we know that they're not having the direct impact and reflecting on exactly, what are the limiting factor needs of the species and how those might be integrated into some of these ecosystem scale projects. It's really challenging, right? But it would be very important for a species working group to be able to explore. Number four, monitoring and assessment of the species group and the ally campaign relationships. So in the third of these recovery wheel sessions, I did a very brief overview of social network analysis. That's something that comes up very frequently in conversations that I have with species working groups as a tool that groups are interested in integrating into their work. Um, I can't emphasize enough how valuable I think those exercises are. And we talked about, really briefly the way that a social network analysis would map different types of relationships and allow a working group just to look at its social network visually and see where it's strong, where it's weak, where it's repetitive, where it's segmented, where it's really well connected. So session three has that overview, and that's a topic I find very interesting and would always be happy to workshop through with species working groups. If the species working group had taken the time during that earlier work through of the wheel to develop a social network analysis, this is where it could be really useful to pull it out and look at what is the relationship between the working group and this broader campaign? What organizations are responsible for these broader ecosystem campaigns? Are those connected to each other? There's endless questions there, but looking at the strength of that relationship and reassessing and reevaluating if necessary. And then also, going back to square one if necessary to establish new relationships that are essential when we think to this ecosystem scale, because they certainly change. If you're very targeted in one specific location working with private landowners, your partnerships that you're prioritizing are going to be different than if you're stepping back and you're looking at ecosystem level, you're looking at broad initiatives. And one is not necessarily more important than the other overall. I think it depends on your goals and where you are in a process. But being reflective about those relationships and what type of effort and work on the part of the species working group might need to go into them is a great thing to do at this stage in the wheel. And then number five, effective communication of success of ecosystem partnerships. So making sure that positive effects to the species are being communicated, that they're being tied in to these other messages that you see here as examples. Bird population growth will capture the attention of many people, not all people, and making sure that when we're looking at success and when we're communicating about conservation success, we're being intentional about the messages and the strategies that we use to do that. Questions, comments, thoughts on ecosystem change? or pieces to add. I'll mention again too, as I always do, that this wheel tool, um, as a Road to Recovery team, we're always thrilled to get feedback on it. So if there are pieces that your working group has explored that you don't see reflected here, you think could be really valuable to include in some of these explanations of criteria, those are always really valuable for us to hear.
Yeah, Katie, I just would say also that um, I think this is a really important section to look at in along with the section 6.1 because that discussion that we often have, are we working on single species working groups or are we working with multiple species and at a bigger scale, at an ecosystem scale? So these two sections of the wheel sort of continue that interplay between the two approaches to the bird conservation and I think the main point is that they complement one another. They don't conflict with one another, and so I think looking at the way in which um, limiting factors are addressed at a very site-specific scale, and also thinking about the way in which larger issues that have to do with regional changes in the environment, like just getting more grass on the landscape, um, can happen side by side, even in the planning stage, in the identification of threats stage, and then finally in this implementation phase. And so, always we're always stressing that complementarity and not trying to be exclusive about, you know, saying that we should go one way or the other. But I think one of the things that emerges in this discussion of ecosystem change is the importance of doing the monitoring and making sure that those broad scale initiatives actually are making differences at the population level for the target species that we're concerned about. You did a great job explaining it, so I just wanted to stress that complementarity.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Tom. And I think one of the resources that's available on the R2R website is a directory that links species working group. It includes species working groups and it includes the migratory bird joint ventures. So you can search that Excel sheet. You could look up a particular species and you could see which joint ventures overlap with that species, or you can look up a joint venture and see which tipping point species fall within the range of that joint venture. And I think that's a really straightforward applied way within the bird conservation community that we can bridge the species approach with the larger scale habitat approach is by making sure that species working groups are connecting well with the joint ventures that are doing habitat restoration work across those species ranges. For some of the species, that's many because the species is traveling so far. But if you can, um, it all goes back to exactly what Tom was saying. As you identify and move between those different scales, having those partners identified can be very valuable. Other comments or questions or examples of this work being done? Okay, I'm going to move forward then. The third segment in the implement action category is sustainability. And so put the picture of the wheel back up here on this slide just to orient us as we come to our last segment here. Can you see I hope you can see my mouse. And you'll notice that the wheel, we get to completion of the wheel here and we hit sustainability. We don't hit recovery. We don't hit some sort of like celebration of walking away from a species because I think we all can probably acknowledge that for many, if not all of these tipping point species, achieving recovery will come with a responsibility of management and of conservation delivery and of advocacy to make sure that these species maintain that recovered status, right? And that the populations don't start to decline again. Um, and so I think it's exciting that our work on these species will continue once they are recovered. I think that the goal here is to make recovery sustainable. And that doesn't mean that we can take our hands off and walk away, but it does mean that the work might change a bit. And so the sustainability section here, it starts with the first criteria being that the focus area recovery is scaled up to range-wide population recovery. And so when we've monitored well, we've been adaptive. We've seen success in focus areas, and we've seen population response to the interventions that have been implemented. Then we can start to scale up and think about range-wide recovery and integrating other focus areas into our strategies. And you'll see that in italics there, it says that this may require going back through the wheel. And that's a question or a discussion point that's come up with several groups while discussing this tool in the recovery wheel is that at some point as a team, you have to make a choice as you move through, because you could be thinking range wide as you move through the whole thing, or you can break it up into categories. You could focus on a particular area that you've identified as a priority and move through the wheel with a focus on that area, and then get here and expand and keep moving through. I think the strategy what I'd love to hear from groups who have used it about how their approach has worked. But it makes sense to me that some of that decision making would come from how much information is known by the like how much knowledge is held by the working group when you begin working through the recovery wheel. Um, if there's a breadth of knowledge about a lot of different priority areas for the species, it might make sense to be holistically looking at the range as you move through and discussing each criteria with regards to those different pieces. But if not, it might make sense to kind of move through and try to get to implementing action where we have the knowledge and the resources to do so, and then continue working on filling in the knowledge gaps for the other pieces. And so I don't think there's not one correct approach to using it. But we do acknowledge that regardless of where a working group is when they come into using this tool, we envision cycling through it for various reasons as the recovery work continues. So number two, range-wide adaptive monitoring plan is put in place. So a long-term monitoring plan that would be designed to be able to detect vulnerabilities for the species. So we work really hard to identify limiting factors that exist now, but that doesn't guarantee that new ones are not going to pop up and new threats are not going to impact the species. And so we want to make sure that monitoring is designed to trigger those things and draw attention to them as quickly as possible so that our recovery efforts and actions can be adaptive as we move forward. Number three, final reporting, documentation, and outreach. So, documentation of the process, the barriers that were faced, the solutions that were discovered, um, is really important for us as a whole, as a bird conservation community. We want to be able to learn from each other, from successes and from challenges. And so, having good documentation of work that's been done, processes that have been implemented, and then feedback on how those have worked it is really valuable and would be something that as a species working group community we would like to bring together to be a resource. And that's part of the hope I think that fueled this forum space in the first place is to provide space for those types of communications. But formalizing it into a document for the working group is a really good way to make sure that we're having thorough documentation of work that's been done. I think a lot of times with working groups, that's happening in a lot of different formats. So project reports that are being put together, publications that members of the working group are working on. And so having a central space for the working group to be bringing all of that material, so you're collecting it all together, be really valuable as a whole. Number four, network and capacity building. So making sure throughout the process of recovery that networking is remaining central, that partnerships are a priority. Engaging partners is something that the working group is truly investing in, being inclusive and accessible. And then capacity building, making sure that when possible, training opportunities are provided, local communities, students from local universities or research stations are engaged in research. That when there's opportunities for field work, that we have that capacity building mindset, um, so that we're training, we're getting more and more people invested in continuing this recovery work. And then that leads us to number five, which is establish relationships that transcend the goals and the issues. So Road to Recovery is focused on tipping point species. Your species working groups are focused generally on one or a small number of those tipping point species. But we want our impact and the work that we do to transcend that, to go beyond our species and even birds, so that we're really focusing on conservation, on community engagement, and on creating a movement that can be sustained through grant cycles, through turnover, that the relationships and the partnerships that we're building are maintained long term. So even when the faces that built them in the first place move on to other things, um, we've developed enough of a culture around this recovery initiative that the work continues. And again, coming back to the naming of this section as sustainability rather than recovery, is reflective of that, right? We want to, regardless of what the species needs in the future, maybe we can scale back. Maybe new threats keep popping up and we have to remain heavily engaged moving forward. Um, Either way, we want the effort and the movement to be sustainable into the future for these tipping point species. Comments on this section and on kind of the wrapping up to the top of the wheel again.
Yeah, sometimes I mean, I think it's intriguing to think about what it means to have relationships that transcend goals and issues that are specifically, initially at least, oriented around um, bringing back a bird population. And one can think of a number of different things like, oh, depending upon how the species working groups are organized. Maybe there's a particular university lab where a lot of research is being done, and it might establish a sister relationship with say a university in Latin America if it's a migratory species. So the idea would be that those two labs continue that relationship, even though they may not be working on that species which originally brought them together. And you can think of sister communities as well. If a lot of researchers or a lot of the bird conservations in the U.S. are organized in a particular community or even a city, then a sister city relationship based around bird conservation ideas, continuing to engender those and to bring those forward and to develop actions that will lead to conservation generally and that kind of a mindset. So all kinds of things like that, which are bigger than the birds themselves. And so that very last segment, I think, is designed to give focus to the idea that the relationships that are built in this conservation work are really, in the end, super important, maybe even more important than the individual actions that are taken for the birds, because they will be the basis for future work and positive action. So it's an interesting section of the wheel to think about. What could that look like?
Yeah, I think I know, many species working groups are in some part driven by grants and people who are doing the research as part of a funded grant. And as those cycles end, there's inevitably turnover of people. And I think engaging the partnerships, like I think, about some of the grants that I'm involved in and how they've all there develops a tree, right, of this project started and then these people went, work together on this project and it builds. And so I think the more we can bring all of the, people working on the species working groups together in settings like this forum is intended to be, that's how those relationships build. And I think Road to Recovery has a role to play in that process and one that we're excited to play in kind of being a standing place for those connections to move through. Um, but it starts, as with any networking, it starts with having the space and showing up for the conversations about what work is going on and where there can be overlap and collaboration. And um, I know that our in-person workshop was a great place for that, and I think doing that as much as possible as a community, and then engaging virtually like this when we can't be together, is a good way just to have the relationships growing, that eventually lead to these types of long-lasting partnerships, um, that have to go beyond individuals, right, and have to be more grounded in values, in goals, in kind of processes rather than specific research targets or questions.
Yeah, I think the birth of the future leaders in conservation it would be a good example of that. So as people work on bird conservation, they realize there are other issues that are really important in terms of determining how they think about their life in relationship to the planet. And so being able to be in a safe place to share those thoughts and to develop new ideas and new ways of thinking about what action can mean are really important. And so this 6.3.5 is um, would be an example. I guess I'd say that the Future Leaders Program would be an example of how that would be a successful outcome of doing bird conservation work.
Absolutely. And I think that network continues to grow, which is really exciting. Excuse me. Other comments or questions, examples from the work that you all have been doing on the ground? We've made it all the way around the wheel, which is very exciting. So I wanted to come back to this slide that I had in, I think, session one when I first introduced the wheel in this forum setting, and started to talk through it. And, what is our vision for the recovery wheel, as a Road to Recovery team? And we have many visions for it, I think. We hope that it continues to evolve, with input from species working groups. We hope that it's useful for working groups and for our bird conservation community as a whole. So for working groups, if your working group has used it, I would love to hear how it went, and what, if any, outcomes you saw from it? Did it facilitate conversation within the group? Have you been able to use it in reporting for a grant, with your organization? But I think these five examples provide a basis for what we envision a working group might be able to do with a completed wheel. So it does provide a structure, and an organization for the work of species recovery. It provides a visual tracker of recovery. And we always like to emphasize that the wheel tracks bird species recovery. It doesn't track the working group's success, as like a human group. It's focused on tracking recovery. Um, I do think it would be very useful for grant applications. It provides a visual that a working group could use to say, here's where we are. with funding for this project, here's where we're going. It's a visual tool that could provide um, kind of concrete evidence for growth. Strategic planning and writing of recovery plans, and then it's a guide and this tool grew from an effort to work towards a gap analysis process. And so it can be a piece of that process for species working groups as well. And then more broadly, as a bird conservation community, we hope that being able to look collectively at completed recovery wheels, we see opportunities for sharing success. We see ways that we can highlight areas for cross collaboration amongst species working groups, tracking overall tipping point species recovery, which is a goal of Road to Recovery, to be able to have consistent metrics across species to track progress of this initiative and movement, um, and to be able to facilitate the work between and among species working groups. So could work if we had a library of completed recovery wheels, a species working group could, in theory, go to that library and look for other species working groups who have made significant success in an area where they are starting to work. And then they could reach out to those working groups to discuss their strategies within that criteria, or within that segment of the wheel. Vice versa, groups that are experiencing a big challenge could look for other groups that maybe are at the same challenge spot in the wheel, and they could come together to look for added capacity or funding to support work in that area. So I see a lot of opportunities for this to really be a tool for both the species working group, but also for us broadly as a working group, a community of species working groups. Um, but step one is for species working groups to complete the wheel. And so, as a reminder, if your species working group has completed the wheel, Road to Recovery would love to see it. And you can email it to our R2R address or to any of the R2R team members. Um, if your working group is working on the wheel, and there are members of our Road to Recovery team, whether it's social science, biology, international partnerships, where you feel you could use support in working through those sections of the wheel, we're eager to join and have those conversations and working sessions with you. So a lot of opportunity for engagement as we move forward, with using the wheel as a tool. Have any working groups who are on the call used it that have any other applications to add, or kind of reflections from working through the wheel with your team? Stephanie, thanks for your comment. That brings up a great point. So Stephanie had a comment in the chat that the wheel has been helpful as a tool for identifying gaps and opportunities outside of a working group. And I think that's another piece that's important to mention is, while the recovery wheel was designed to guide species working groups through tracking and planning recovery of the species that they're focused on, um, it's a comprehensive conservation tool um, that hopefully can be applicable in other parts of your work. I know many species working group members wear many hats in the roles that you play professionally, and personally maybe too. And so wherever this guide can be useful, we're eager to hear those reflections and learn about those applications.
Um, I'll just add one comment in that it has been I've been working with the Wimbrel working group crew, and we kind of there was a great deal of momentum early on, and so like the group kind of coalesced, and then we sort of took a little pause and started working through the wheel, and we're still in the process of working through the wheel, but having the framework has been really helpful, I think, and just in terms of, it's been interesting kind of talking through things, bouncing around a bit through the wheel as a group. But just having sort of a roadmap has been helpful.
That's awesome to hear. I'm glad to hear that that it's being used. Yeah, I think having it as just a guide that no one member of the working group has to take responsibility in completing. It's something there that already exists. Um, can be a good way to bring people together without putting a lot of extra work and planning on any particular member of the group. So that's awesome to hear. Any others on the call with uses? So we have received some completed wheels, which are wonderful to see, and we're creating a road to recovery library of those. So Paul put the R2R Birds email in the chat. Any completed wheels, we would love to see. We will not hold you to anything that's on them. It's a learning experience for us to be able to see, um, see the products as working groups work through this process and use this tool. And as I said, myself or other members of our team are eager to join in these conversations and support working groups in using the tool. So don't hesitate to reach out and invite us to at any sessions that are focused around the wheel as well. It's great for us to learn about how it can be most useful. And then also to be able to provide any guidance in those content areas that would be useful as well. Jim, I'm reading your question. So let's see. The Archer Wheel is a self-assessment tool, which I would agree. Wondering about how people combine it with broad planning frameworks, or if they use the wheel in place of one of those planning frameworks. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think looking at your list of examples there, the conservation standards piece is the one that I have heard come up the most. Um, Certainly would love to hear from any of the groups that have used it. What I'm hearing so far from groups is that it's in combination, and it's its own tool that would complement or supplement work that's being done within another framework. I have not worked with a particular group that I know of that has really specifically gone through any other sort of um, planning framework or process and then used the wheel to compare. Tom, I don't know if you know any examples of that off the top of your head. They do think it's being used. I don't think it's necessarily replacing anything. I think it's complementary to whatever the working groups have been using to date.
Well, the wheel was developed specifically um, for the single species approach that Road to Recovery has been recommending, and especially the idea of identifying limiting factors. And so it, if you look at the wheel, you can see it's really heavy on I would say heavy on the front end. The idea of identifying the limiting factor for a particular species, but any of the other conservation planning tools would be ideally complementary. And I was thinking as we were talking about this last section that using the conservation standards, for example, and having a really nicely fleshed out results chain where you had identified particular strategies and, well, particularly threats and the strategies that would be used to address those threats and mapped it out in a very detailed way. That would be a really nice framework for thinking about monitoring or where the monitoring points might be in that whole process of moving from one situation to another situation within that flow chart or that situational analysis. So tools like having those results chains that are developed in the conservation standards would be really useful, especially in this last segment of the wheel. Obviously, implementing actions are going to be it's going to be take a lot of time and a lot of work, and so it's 1/6 of the wheel, but maybe it's 99% of the work or something like that. So any additional tools um, could be used in conjunction with the wheel, and it's not meant to be a replacement for any of those things like the conservation standards, which many groups use as a work planning tool. I think this is again, and also I think one of the key attributes that makes the wheel a little bit different is that it's the way in which it incorporates social science and diversity and inclusion as key elements in the entire process.
Yeah, we did. In the, I think the last session, use conservation standards and a results chain as the example. How that thought process is really valuable. Yeah, I think they can come together well, and I would be eager to hear from species working groups who have used multiple approaches or who have kind of dabbled in different frameworks. Where they think they play in well together and how they can plug into this wheel process. We're almost to time. So where we're going from here, we've finished our wheel series of 6. And though we've completed the overview of the recovery wheel, the Road to Recovery Species Working Group forum space will continue moving forward. And we will resume forums on a bi-monthly schedule starting in September. We're really open to topics that are of interest to species working groups. So this forum space was designed to bring species working groups together and not necessarily be led by Road to Recovery in format as we've kind of adopted for the overview of the wheel, but to be more of a sharing space and a space for open dialogue about topics that are of great interest. And so if there are sections of the wheel that kind of have sparked the most conversation within your species working group, or topics that more conversation, hearing from other species working groups about successes and challenges would be valuable. We'd love to hear those suggestions as we start planning the continuation of this forum space for species working groups. I know so far feedback we've gotten has highlighted partnerships, building, maintaining, identifying partners, looking at limiting factors, of course, is always one that comes up. We talked about kind of those social network pieces. But as the other topics come up with your species working group, whether it's while working on the wheel or in other conversations, that would be good to spark conversation amongst the species working groups. We want that feedback as well as we plan for going forward. So unless there are other questions or comments, we will wrap up right on time. Thank you so much for your participation in this session and the Wheel series as a whole. As a reminder, all of those recordings in both Spanish and English are available on the Road to Recovery website, so a good place to head to as your species working group or anyone is working with the wheel itself for overviews, highlights, reminders of the content that's included in each of those action categories. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thank you, Katie.